guys for joining us tonight. My name is Elizabeth Nolan Brown. I am the president of Feminists for Liberty, as well as a senior editor at Reason Magazine. I am happy to welcome you guys to our talk tonight on sexism in the U.S. tax code, which is a topic that my fellow Feminists for Liberty founder, Murti, has been wanting to talk about for a long while. So we figured we were going to do it in April, and now the tax day was extended, so we pushed it back to March also. Feminists for Liberty, just real quick, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting the values and voices of libertarian feminism. We like to say we are anti-sexism and anti-statism, pro-markets and pro-choice, and we believe in consent in all things. You can follow, if you are watching and want to tweet about this or share on social media, please use the hashtag F4LChats. That's F4L chats. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kat.
Awesome, thank you. Hey everyone, I am Murti, and as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm the executive director of Feminists for Liberty, co-founder along with Liz, and I do constantly always want to talk about tax policy, and I'm finally getting my chance now that tax day is this coming weekend. And the reason that I want to is that, like many other supposedly gender neutral policies, the US tax code is actually disproportionately impacts people on a gender basis, but people just don't realize that. And in a lot of cases, those impacts are actually more of a feature that's been built into the system rather than a bug, which I think is just a huge part of the conversation that gets left out. Departed Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually cut her teeth on Moritz v. Irs, the first of many gender discrimination lawsuits she argued in court, and a fact that few Americans likely knew, at least until the recent movie came out on the basis of sex. So that case actually revolved around a small tax deduction for caregiver expenses, which was not available to a gentleman named Charles Moritz. Now, Charles Moritz was a never married man who was taking care of his disabled mother, but the IRS did not consider that a man, let alone a man who wasn't even a widower, a man who had never been married, would ever be in such a caretaker role. And so as an unmarried man, he actually could not take that deduction simply on the basis of his sex. But while that case certainly did start the beginning of RBG's career, that kind of casual sexism permeates the US tax code still. A lot of people don't know that the widely used system of joint tax filing that we continue to use today, very popular, was actually instituted in 1948 as soldiers were returning from World War II, because the US government was looking around, and as women had joined the workforce in huge numbers during the war, they were now worried that these new returning soldiers wouldn't be able to get jobs. So they actually constructed the tax code in such a way as to incentivize these now working women to go back and become homemakers. That still continues today, and despite the normalization of dual income households, which most American families actually are nowadays, modern tax policy continues to push married women at virtually every income level out of the workforce, either to work fewer hours than they otherwise would, or to stay out of the labor pool entirely, which is actually a major contributing factor to the gender pay gap. So those are just a couple examples, but we're going to have a really interesting discussion for you here tonight on the many different ways in which sexism is baked into the US tax code. And you guys all signed up for this event. Presumably you find it just as interesting as I do. So we are going to have a lot of room for questions. As anything comes up throughout the evening, feel free to just type it into that little box on the bottom of your screen. We'll be making sure to have lots of time to answer those questions towards the end. You can also tweet them, as Elizabeth mentioned, using hashtag F4LChats. And with no further ado, let me introduce you to our speakers for tonight. First, we have Erin Partin. Erin is an experienced researcher working in the think tank industry. She is skilled in data analysis, writing, and programming, and has a focus on both health and fiscal policy. However, you'll see her writing across a wide variety of topics, everything to do from mask mandates to the war on drugs to sex work and everything in between. Erin is currently in the process of completing her PhD in economics from American University. You can find her on Twitter as @Erin_Partin, and that's Partin with an I. I also would like to introduce you to Aeris Stewart. Aeris is a student and a longtime liberty activist who splits their time between the East and West coasts. They first got involved in the liberty movement when they were 15 and have since been a Students for Liberty local coordinator, Instagram manager for the Joe Jorgensen campaign, and have worked at 2 different tax policy related organizations. You can follow Aeris on Twitter as @Aeris_Ruby. So let's get started with this. A lot of people view tax code as boring. Tax policy is just mind-numbingly boring. You bring this up, their eyes glaze over, they don't want to talk about it. I'm obviously a bit of a weirdo here. I'm the girl who on numerous occasions has pulled out tax charts at parties because I want to show people something. So I'm a little bit different here, but I have a feeling that the rest of you watching tonight are a bit too. So Aeris, Erin, what got you interested in this topic?
I can start off. So I got interested in tax policy at my first real internship at Tax Foundation the summer of 2019. I actually joined them as a marketing and development intern and wasn't expecting to delve into the policy side as much. But a lot of the stuff that I worked with, even with drafting copy for like ads and things, involved getting a better understanding of the tax policy issues. I also had an opportunity to work on a blog post about Beto O'Rourke's war tax proposal. And in doing research for that, I started to see tax policy as like this unsolvable puzzle. And that was really interesting for me because what I'd seen in the news made tax seem like this very simple thing. Like people have to pay their fair share, therefore we have a wealth tax, like a very point A to point B type of thing. But the more research I did, the more complicated it seemed. And that was really appealing and interesting to me. So I'm back in the tax space and it's a really fun time.
I got interested in tax policy in part because I have an incurable case of curiosity for most things relating to public policy and the like. And to me, tax policy is incredibly important. It touches all of us who are employed, who are not employed. We all have to deal with the tax system on a day-to-day basis. Going down, buying a soda from CVS, you're going to be paying a sales tax on that most likely. Whatever income you earn, going to be paying taxes on that. And while it seems, again, like, yeah, a pretty simple system, you earn money, you pay the government money, they presumably provide you services, it's really not. It affects, the tax policy is something that affects everyone and not always in fair or noticeable ways. There are instances baked into the tax policy that we'll be getting into where it is designed to be unfair to specific groups of people, designed to affect people differently. And by identifying these areas and by talking about them and by getting together and discussing, what can we do? It's not a simple problem, but we can identify and then start to figure out how to make those improvements on the margin.
Yeah, I think I feel very similarly. It's one of those things where it's just like tax policy seems simple. It just seems like a fact of life, but in actuality, it's just part of everyone's everything, and it influences so many of the choices available to us and what we end up doing, and it's not always visible to people how that's happening. And so just to start off, let's talk about, is it appropriate for the tax code to include these nudges that are designed to incentivize certain lifestyles or life choices that people make, and why or why not?
I mean, I think the answer to that I'm sorry, this is a cop-out, it kind of depends on what you see the role of the government as being. If you see the role of the government as solving some inherent problem that exists because society is not constructed in the proper way, then you'd be all for the nudges. If you're more like me, however, and think that people should have the right to determine how they live their life and what decisions they make without excessive pressure, visible or invisible, I tend to think that, nudges tend to be complicated and not always, are you going in the right direction, and who's determining what that right direction is?
I would agree with Erin that the context matters. I would also say in general, my personal preference is that the tax code be more neutral than not. However, I understand that neutrality isn't always possible in the way that we might think of it. So as we get into this conversation about like gender equality in the tax code, we'll find that, some instances of gender inequality are actively caused by the tax code, whereas in some instances, it's the tax code that's reflecting existing gender inequality. So if we want to fix that inequality, we would have to provide a nudge in the opposite direction. I guess for me, the determining factor is that every single tax policy that we have has this ripple effect. And it's really hard to just pinpoint one thing and not have it change everything else. So I would say in general, while it's appropriate to think about the way that tax code will incentivize certain behaviors, I would say that a light hand or a light touch is better than the opposite.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, nudges are incredibly effective and generally very cheap ways to induce, substantial changes in behavior. But again, Aeris is right that we need that light touch to drive that. Otherwise, things get out of hand pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think it's also, as you pointed out, Erin, a very much a philosophical question of should the government be trying to give that light touch to push people in one direction or another? I would say no, but some people might say yes. But let's start with a really basic one. Make sure we're all on the same page here. This event is called Sexism in the U.S. Tax Code. Is the current U.S. tax code sexist, and in what ways?
I mean, in a word, yes. I think you alluded to it in the beginning. From its, the U.S. tax code, income tax code was, if you'll forgive a bit of a historical aside for a moment, income tax.
About the historical aside.
Yeah. Income tax as we know it started, kind of came into effect around 1913, but it wasn't until 1948 that we shifted from a separate filing system to this new concept of a joint filing system for married people. And in fact, one of the architects of this joint filing system, Stanley Surrey, was quite explicit about his goals. He wrote, "Wives need not continue to master the details of the retail drug business, electrical equipment business, or construction business, but may turn from their partnership duties to the pursuit of homemaking." The introduction of this joint filing system in post-World War II, Kat, as you were talking about before, was explicitly to discourage women from remaining in the labor force. Labor markets were tight. There were a lot of men returning from war. And the thought was, well, women don't belong in the workforce. Let's make sure that not only do we start hiring more men and perhaps firing more women or removing them from the workforce explicitly from the side of businesses, but let's also just make it really unattractive for them to remain in the labor force.
Right.
Yes, I think Erin did a really good job of touching on the way that the joint filing system disincentivizes women to be in the workplace. I'd like to point out also from an intersectional lens that it disproportionately impacts African Americans, Black women particularly. Yes, the tax code is sexist. It also has some racist aspects to it, both in the code itself and in its enforcement. It's ableist. There's an incentive towards, this marriage bonus, but that isn't always accessible. Marriage equality is not yet achieved, but if you think about it in terms of like, if gay people are able to get married, that's still a very recent development. And so, yes, on a lot of levels, the tax code sort of perpetuates all of these different problems that we see in our society, whether it's sexism, racism, etc.
Right, and it's sort of built into it in a very real way. But is that only about the income tax, or are there other areas in which the tax code has negative impacts on gender equality or other types of equality?
So in preparation for this, I actually looked at a report from the National Women's Law Center. They did a series of reports about gender inequality in the tax code, and they actually had some interesting areas that I wouldn't have necessarily thought about. So for example, they were talking about, tax deductions based off of like the accumulation of capital for a business, for example, or for home ownership, and how those benefits aren't as accessible to women and therefore perpetuate this sort of gender equality. So in the example of the business and capital deduction, men are more likely to own businesses that are capital intensive versus women who are more likely to own businesses that are more service oriented. So when you look at tax deductions that are available for capital, they don't necessarily reach women. And that's a way that the tax code can perpetuate gender inequality, even though on the face it's a gender neutral piece of tax policy.
Yeah. I think similarly things like I think the same logic applies to things like the mortgage deduction. Women and people of color are disproportionately denied mortgages, thus, preventing them from ever being eligible for certain types of deductions. There's also an issue of, wealthy versus poor taxpayers, things like higher education deductions and tax credits that disproportionately impact people across the spectrum. I think the one other example I can think of is how workers' compensation claims. If you're granted a workers' compensation claim, that is non-taxable income. However, if you're granted a settlement for sexual harassment or some other type of employment discrimination, which would disproportionately be those awards would be disproportionately won by women and other minorities, that is considered taxable income for no clear reason. So if you fall off a ladder at work, you don't have to pay tax on that settlement. If your boss makes an unwanted sexual advance at you and you get a settlement from the company, you're out of luck.
That's actually really interesting. I didn't know that one. And yeah, certainly seems like it's if it is meant to be a nudge, who knows? It certainly seems like a nudge against filing those types of claims.
Right. In fact, it gets worse. Businesses can actually claim settlements that they pay for discrimination claims. They can claim those as business expenses.
Oh,
and
yeah,
thus
business, right?
Right. And then thus, their tax burden is lowered for paying out these settlements. But the people they're paying the settlements to, get dinged for that extra income. So
yeah. See, this is exactly why I always want to talk about tax policy, because there's all these little things hidden in it that people just completely miss. So one of those that I think probably impacts a lot of Americans, probably most Americans, or at least a very large group of Americans. This is one of those charts that I start pulling out at parties. Let's talk about the marriage tax penalty and the marriage tax benefit. I think that it's very interesting because a lot of people, it's sort of like an offhand joke that people make that like you get married for the tax benefits. But as we've sort of alluded to a little bit, that's not always the case. What's actually going on here?
So I'm going to do everyone a favor and not start throwing out numbers of, various examples of things, what the marginal tax rate is for someone who makes X dollars. I promise I'm not going to do that. There are plenty of examples online that you can find. But,
Tax Foundation has some great charts.
Right. Yes. But, simply put, a marriage penalty or benefit is an increase or decrease in tax liability that married couples experience when filing a joint return compared to what their tax burden would be if they had filed separately. So frequently what you see most of the time with the current income tax system is very crude. When you're filing jointly, the the amount of income you can earn jointly effectively doubles under every marginal tax rate. So generally speaking, you would expect to see a marriage penalty for two individuals who are earning about the same amount of money, because what that would do is the pooled amount would push them into a higher tax bracket. They'd be paying more tax per dollar that they bring in. And this is when you see, women primarily choosing to leave the workforce, versus a marriage benefit is, for example, if you have one high earner and one member of the couple is not working, well, then the higher earner effectively gets bumped down into a lower tax bracket, faces a lower tax burden, because they are granted a larger allowance on how much income they can earn before the next tax rate goes into effect.
Or if you have a higher earner and a much lower earner as well.
Yes.
Yeah,
which is interesting.
I wanted to tie back like the technical aspect that Erin mentioned with the big picture stuff that Kat was talking about in the introduction. So you see this based off of this breadwinner model of the family. So typically a man and a woman, the husband is the primary earner, the wife stays at home and makes children and cares for the children. And so that's what this joint taxation system here in the States is incentivizing. And the impact of that's really important. So if you think of a lesbian couple, for example, both are women, both are more likely to be participating in the workforce, they experience a marriage penalty. African Americans, on average, are less likely to get married. If they do get married, they face a higher divorce rate. And if they get divorced, they're less likely to be remarried, which means that they have less access to this marriage benefit that comes out of this joint taxation system. Educated women, more likely to join into the workforce, they're less likely to appreciate this marriage benefit. So, it all sort of connects together. It seems like just a different way maybe of filing taxes, but it actually has a pretty disproportionate impact based off of your race and your gender.
Yeah, and the fact that specifically equal earner or near equal earner couples are the ones who are getting most penalized, I think, is also just a really interesting aspect of that. Mm-hmm. So for the most part, the US tax code, despite all of what we're talking about here, is written in a gender neutral manner, written using gender neutral language. It's not as if, at least, I'm not a tax attorney and I'm not going to claim to have read the entire US tax code, but I don't think that there's not like stuff written in there around joint tax earner law that says like, we want to penalize women who make the same as their husbands, right? But it still has these gender neutral impacts. So why is that? And how might that apply in other policy areas? What lessons can we get from that?
Well, I think it's important to note that you're right. The US tax code has almost, probably fewer than 10 instances of any type of gendered term appearing in it. Most of it is relating to things like more health related subsections. Mm-hmm. But, just because it's written in kind of gender blind language does not, of course, mean the impact is gender neutral. And of course, we've discussed how this current system of joint filing was explicitly designed to discourage women from entering the labor force. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the reason that worked is because of these entrenched social norms. Women stay at home, men are the breadwinners, you just have a one income household. And I think this is pervasive thinking across all types of public policy. Mm-hmm. Whether or not it's intended, it could be, oh, well, we're not saying that only men can benefit from this particular tax credit, or only women are eligible for this social program. But because of, the underlying social structures that we are all aware of all the time, you do see these disparate impacts, failing to acknowledge the heterogeneity in the population and how one size fits all policy basically fits nobody, on a very granular level. That's something that's not discussed enough, I don't think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree. I also think it's worth noting that the burden of proof to prove that a piece of policy is discriminating based off gender is exceptionally high, and we don't actually have the tools to prove it. The IRS doesn't keep track of this stuff based off of gender or race. And there's definitely a good discussion on whether or not they should do that. However, it means that, when we look at these tax policies, we can talk about the incentives and we can get information from outside sources, but where you would expect the data to come from, we actually don't have. So I think it would be very hard to make a case for, something like the joint taxation system. Like, this is what's happening and the impact is strong enough that we can prove that it's discriminating based off of gender.
Yeah, and it's definitely hard to make that case when, again, the vast majority of Americans just don't know the history and probably would fall asleep before you could finish explaining it to them, which is an unfortunate setback here as well. But so, like, given all of this, and given the fact that clearly just using that gender neutral language doesn't result in a gender neutral tax policy, what would a truly gender neutral tax policy look like?
I can start with that. And my answer, honestly, is that I don't know. I feel like a lot of people don't. Even in the report that I mentioned earlier from the National Women's Law Center, they made it very clear that they were talking about considerations that should be made that were more gendered, and not that they had any specific solutions for it. A, because of the data problem that I mentioned earlier, and B, because of this like ripple effect that I also mentioned earlier, which is that, you can think that you're changing something to be more gender neutral, and then you look at it 10 years down the line and it's changed something in a way that was completely unintended. So I think the first step, honestly, is to have more conversations like this one, where we're talking about how tax codes incentivize certain behavior on a gendered line. And then, if we have the information at some point down the line, we can make better decisions about what would make our tax code more gender neutral. Going to a single filing system, I think, would be a great idea at some point. But, that's a really big undertaking. And, might harm people who got married for this certain benefit. So, there are lots of different, questions about it. I don't know. I think that it's something that, in the tax space should be, explored a lot more in depth.
Yeah, certainly. I think you're right that a lot of it too is just like a fundamental failure of central planning, right? Like, even if there's no way for us to know, like, oh, okay, if we make this one little change, you've got this butterfly effect. Like, who is it going to impact? How?
Right. And yeah, like I agree on almost all those counts. Like I also don't know how to fix the tax system. If I did, well, I'd be a very in-demand person, I suppose. It's interesting. There has been not much, but there has been a historical trend of pushing to return the US to a separate filing system. There were some failed attempts in the late 1990s, which interestingly was also at the peak of women's labor force participation. So in terms of the timing on that, I found that curious. There hasn't really been that much effort since then. I think there are concerns that it would, it would harm families. How would you sort out various child tax credits, caregiver tax credits? I think at this point people look and they're like, well, this seems more complicated. Nobody, or at least not too many people, are making a big fuss about the fact that the current system is inherently flawed. We'll just stay at the status quo. If there's anything I've learned from my time doing policy work in the district, it's inertia usually wins.
Yeah.
So
Unfortunately, yeah, the swamp keeps swamping. So do you think, so thinking about this inertia, right? You've got the inertia of the code itself. You've got which is just like a behemoth. I don't think anyone really knows every little thing that's in it, right? And then you've also got this changing culture that is changing in different ways, and in certain ways kind of pushing against that. So keeping all of this in mind, do you think the tax code is becoming more or less sexist over time? And is that a result of changes in tax policy, or is something else happening?
I mean, I think we're seeing, there are very few instances of such obvious sexism as, for example, the Moritz case. It's no longer directly codified. However, I don't think the tax code itself is getting more or less sexist. I think that, since the late 1940s, since the introduction of the joint filing system, I think that the structure of the US economy is changing in ways that we perhaps notice it more, in terms of its impact on the basis of sex, and also on the basis of race, and on the basis of class. So I don't think the system itself is changing. I think society is changing and beginning to notice it, which does give me some hope that, as these issues become more clear, there's more of a drive to actually enact meaningful change.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say with, President Biden's proposed tax plans, and some of the proposed changes to either the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit, that there is an attempt to make the tax code more equal, but not necessarily in the way that we've been discussing it. We talked about different ways the tax code could be sexist. One of the things that we mentioned briefly was this, idea of like deductions based off of like business expenses. And one thing that you can't deduct the cost of for is childcare, which for women obviously is going to be a huge expense when it comes to being able to conduct business.
Right. It's actually one of those things that when you look at the marriage tax penalty, that's basically what we're looking at, where if women are looking at, okay, if I stay at home and continue to take care of my child after maternity leave, versus if I go back into the workforce and getting taxed at a higher rate, plus I have to pay for childcare, does it make sense for me to work this amount of hours and be coming out even either way?
Yeah, so if you're trying to change either of those things, the CTC, the ITC, lots of other numbers of like tax-based like assistance for families, I could see that as being like a way of trying to help women get the same benefits as men out of the tax code. But again, I feel like, there needs to be like either a lighter touch, or, maybe instead of like trying to like increase the benefits that one gender is getting relative to the other, looking at the privileges that the code is affording to one and trying to decrease those in a way. I don't know. But yeah, I would say that over time, that at least there's more people are thinking about how to make the tax code more gender neutral. And this is one of the ways that they're doing it. I have no idea if it's going to be successful though.
Yeah, I think I'm certainly hopeful. I would like to believe that it is moving in that direction. It certainly has since Moritz, but there's obviously many problems still. One of the things that I think, one of the few things around the tax code that has actually gotten mainstream attention in the last few years has been the tax, not in the income taxes, but in terms of sales taxes on menstrual hygiene products. So that's things like tampons, pads, that kind of thing. Should those be taxed? And are there other sex-specific products that should be exempted in order to make taxes more gender neutral? Is there a real impact? Is that a real issue?
Yeah, I mean, you can just, Google tampon tax, and there's, thousands of pieces, various estimates of how much women tend to pay in an additional tax burden, because of a whole variety of things, but also, in one of the big drivers is the, sales tax on menstrual hygiene products. I believe there's still, 30 states that tax these products. Before 2016, I think there were about 10. In the past 4 or 5 years, another 10 in the District of Columbia have, largely because of public pressure, have instituted legislation that exempts these products from sales tax. But you have, it's really unique in that it is things like condoms, lube, oral contraceptives, Viagra, those are all tax exempt. And yet menstrual hygiene products, which I, don't think anyone would consider a luxury good, they're subject to sales tax, which seems, no one seems to have a good reason for it, including in states where there still is a tampon tax. So yeah, there's no good policy reason that this should be the case.
Yeah, certainly when other health goods are not, right? I think it comes down to that idea of like, do people actually consider this a necessity or not?
Mhm.
One of the other kind of interesting topics that gets a lot of attention is the so-called pink tax, which I brought up today because of the name, but of course it's not actually a tax, right? It's an upcharge on products that are traditionally intended for women, which only have cosmetic differences from comparable products for men. So this is like, for instance, razor blades, or let's say like you have the toolkit that is available in black, or the toolkit is available in pink, right? Like, so again, that's not exactly a tax, but people do call it a tax. So what do you think about that? Is that an issue? Should people care about this? Why or why not?
The discourse around the pink tax has always confused me, to be honest, because I would just buy the men's razors. So it feels like something that like is partially perpetuated based off of the demand. Like if you stop buying all the pink razors and things, maybe it wouldn't cost more, but I don't know, that's just me. I don't tend to see it as like a big problem. It's not government instituted, it's sort of perpetuated by the, if there's a market for it, then it'll continue to exist.
Yeah, I think definitely. I will say I do in fact own a pink drill because I was willing to pay a couple more dollars because it was cute.
Right. Like I agree. I don't think this is, a deep market failure that the government has to sweep in to correct. There is research showing that women are a lot less sensitive to prices and are thus perhaps willing to pay more for these products. I do recall a few years ago a huge uproar over, I believe it was Bic. Hope they don't sue me if I'm getting the wrong pen company, but making pens for her. And selling them at twice the cost of their standard ballpoint pen. And with that, it's like, okay, well, if you want to pay twice as much so you get a pen that is pink, fine, do that. I think it's frankly silly and more a reflection of the norms that we've all internalized or been raised to believe are true. But I think consumers should be allowed the space to make the decisions. And again, I don't think it's necessary that the government come and start saying you can't sell pink tennis rackets for $5 more. Markets do strange things sometimes. They might not always seem to make sense, but it's working. They wouldn't be doing this if it weren't profitable for them.
Right. Yeah. So, it costs more because people will pay more. That's really all it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to have time for audience questions. If you do have any, I've seen a couple come in the box, but feel free to type them in now. I'm going to ask one final question, which it's totally off the cuff here, but if you could change, we've talked about all of these different things. If you could change one aspect of the tax code or one of these things that we've talked about, just one of these things that you can just sort of wave your arm and next year, tax day, it won't be a thing, what would you do? What would you pick? And why?
Oh man. Not pay taxes.
Yeah, you know what? I would love that one. So
okay. I mean, I think if I could magically wave my magic wand and revert back to a separate tax filing system I think I would do that. You know, it might be a complete mess, so hopefully it'd have, you know, an undo button on that magic wand. But I think that would be a really interesting experiment to see.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
would generally second that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Liz, welcome back.
Hi, I've been here, just been muted. Learning a lot. Thank you, our panelists. This has been really good so far. As Kat said, if anyone that's watching has any questions, please leave them in the chat right now. I think right now we only have one question so far. Grace Fendrick had asked earlier about the marriage penalty in welfare, and if this was another example of penalizing who chooses to get married, which I guess is not maybe directly related to the tax code, but do any of you guys have thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that that does bring up an interesting point. There is some concern that under the current tax structure, particularly for lower income individuals, they're disincentivized to marry because pooling their income would raise their joint income to a level at which they would not be eligible for various subsidies, whether that's, you know, subsidies for their childcare, higher tax credits. So there is a disincentive kind of baked into that. And again, this, you know, for two, you know, solidly middle class level earners getting married, it might be a wash. There might be a slight marriage penalty. There might be a slight marriage benefit. It won't really change their day-to-day life. But if you're considering, if I get married, will we make too much money to qualify for food stamps? You know, that is a serious concern. So I think, you know, especially at the, you know, at the extreme ends of the wealth spectrum, you know, these concerns are really important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Michael Tanner covers this a lot in his book, which I know that I recommend all the time to everyone. So people are probably very bored of this, but it is a great book, The Inclusive Economy. That book goes through these sort of like institutional racism, classism, and sexism that happens in society that are sort of built into policy. And this is a huge part of it on all three of those grounds.
Eris, did you have anything to add there?
I was just thinking about like going back to the incentives. Like one of the things that I wonder with expanding the ITC or the CTC is the accompanying incentives to either get married or not get married that go along with it, because the margins at which you're making the decisions change. So I think that's another important thing to keep in mind. Perhaps the other way around is that when we change at what point someone can get benefits, that might impact their decisions in a way that we don't necessarily want either.
We have another question from Tristan here in our chat. It says, Eris, you talked earlier about the tax code negatively affecting people of color. I know intergenerational wealth is a struggle in POC communities and LGBT estranged from family. Any insight on how the tax code might exacerbate this issue?
So I do have an answer to this. It's not super related to gender, unfortunately. But there's this really great article that we ran through tax notes on racial inequality in the tax code from Andrew Carl from the University of Virginia. And he talks about the racist history of property taxes in the wake of Jim Crow and how the enforcement of property taxes was used to take property from Black families. I say was, but this is like still a thing, to be honest. And so, yes, I would say for, you know, minorities, whether that be gender minorities or sexual minorities, the enforcement of certain aspects of the tax code, I think, can be a really big driver of inequality. And obviously, when it comes to something like property, you know, if you get your property taken from you, that's going to have a multi-generational effect. So thank you for bringing that up. I would say that's definitely more on the enforcement aspect than it is the tax code itself, though.
So I'd actually like to, first off, I want to say Tristan has followed up with queer people are gender. I agree, sure. But I think I'd like to push a little bit more on part of Tristan's question there, which is the LGBT aspect of that, because I think that it's definitely a big part of what weighed into the marriage equality fight. As Aeris, as you mentioned earlier, we still don't really have full marriage equality. Do y'all have any thoughts around the LGBT aspect of how these tax incentives?
I mean, I think it's still a little early to tell how tax incentives have mattered. I think a large part of the push for marriage equality is, less. We want to be, taxed like straight people, and more, more about issues like the right to visit people in hospitals, the shared parental rights, etc. There is some work just starting to be done. There are some large national surveys that only in the past 3 or 4 years have started asking questions relating to household structure of same-sex couples. And so again, we're waiting on the data. It just hasn't been collected. And so now, people are starting to do the work to try to examine, okay, what are we seeing? Are we seeing better outcomes? Generally speaking, early evidence seems to show that the ability to be married and have near marriage equality for LGBT people is in fact improving economic outcomes. So still to be determined, there's still a lot of work to be done in that particular area.
I mean, it's so recent, honestly, and it's not like we have a great basis of data. People were disincentivized from even revealing that they were in these couples for a very long time, let alone kept out of the legal recognition.
So,
Liz, sorry, was I cutting you off? Yes, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I'm going to give one more chance if anyone has any more questions. If not, then I think we'll wrap things up. Or yeah, if Aeris or Erin, if you guys have anything else you wanted to say.
About, I think I mentioned briefly earlier the data collection hurdle, and I think I saw a question about why the IRS doesn't collect it. I don't know if there's any ill intent behind it, to be honest. I do know that the IRS is severely underfunded as it is, like intensely behind on like the basics of what they need to do. And so I would say gathering data on race and gender would first and foremost be a funding issue for the IRS. I don't know if they can afford to collect and analyze that large amount of data. But also, like, I personally don't need the IRS to know that I'm Black, especially if, they're already using the tax code in a discriminatory way. So I think that's a really, a conversation that we should have more in the tax space of, yes, we want more data, but what is the cost of getting it? And, is there a better way to get it than, having the government involved? Because that doesn't always end well.
Right. I think that's something we see with the census too, like who is most likely to respond versus like which data segments are missing, right? So unless there's any other questions, I would like, this has been a really good discussion. It's been really interesting. It's sort of ranged over a bunch of different things. What 1 or 2 quick nuggets of knowledge would you like people to take away from tonight's chat that we've had here?
Well, I think, I have to let my inner economist out. Incentives matter, whether they're large or small, whether they're visible or invisible, explicit or implicit. We need to recognize them. And it's really critical that policymakers understand that there are differential impacts of broad public policy. The perfect system doesn't exist. Any system that we have that is created by humans will be imperfect. It will artificially create winners and losers, but recognizing that and making decisions and understanding, yes, we are deciding to do things in this way, regardless of its impact, positive or negative, on these groups. I think that's the only way to move forward in good faith.
Yeah, I've had incentives matter written down on my list as well. And then the second one, this is for an audience of, I'm guessing, mostly libertarians, is just to be wary of people who say that tax policy is very simple. I feel like, you know, it's really easy to have the tax policy discussion get reduced to like, oh, what's fair, what's right, like who needs to pay their fair share, and we sort of forget about the bigger picture and the impact that the tax policy will actually have on people. So taxation is theft, great slogan. Talking about the budget and how we should spend less overall, also good. But this is obviously a complicated conversation that merits a little bit more attention to detail. So that would be my big second lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. Taxation is theft. I think so. But beyond that, it also just impacts people, even people who might even support taxation in a myriad of ways that they may not realize.
Aeris and Erin, do you want to end by telling people where they can find your work online or where they can find you on social media?
I think, as Kat mentioned, you can find me on Twitter at Erin_Partin. I'm not super active on social media, but I occasionally tweet pictures of my dog and usually links to my work. So,
and some great cat gifs.
Oh yes.
You can find me on Twitter at Aeris_Ruby or at Instagram with the same handle, Aeris_Ruby. So you will notice that my Instagram is more dedicated to my music career. So just forewarning there.
Will you have a song about the tax system anytime soon?
I'm working on it. I feel like that would be a really great thing to have.
I would listen to it, just FYI. You've got at least one listener.
Review it for our upcoming Feminists for Liberty zine.
Highly recommend everyone goes and listens to the song Who's Yellin' Now. It's quite wonderful. It's about Janet Yellen as first female Secretary of Treasury. So only slightly related, but it's pretty incredible.
It will be happening tonight.
I want to encourage everyone, or just let everyone know that you can find Feminists for Liberty at our website, feministsforliberty.com. We are on Twitter at Feminist Liberty. There's no S there. And we are on Facebook and Instagram at Feminists for Liberty. Also, we are on YouTube. You can go to youtube.com/c/Feminists for Liberty and find us there. You can subscribe and you will see this chat and all of our future F for All chats. Also, Kat and I have a video series where we do little bite-sized doses of libertarian feminism commentary on different topics every 2 weeks. And yeah, so also, I just want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for watching and thank our speakers very much. This has been really, really interesting. And I think there's been just so many good points brought up tonight. And I think that's it.
I will add a final point. We are a very small nonprofit. And the way that we can do all this kind of stuff is largely through very small donations from folks who like our work. So please go to our website, feministsforliberty.com, and throw us a couple bucks. It goes a long way.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you.